Hey, good morning, guys. This is Doc Hollis. We are here to go through an exciting bit of a review on why we can believe in the Bible. This is an apologetics course. It's designed to help individuals that are either new believers or even old believers to help better understand why and how they can actually trust the Bible. This is a part of a ongoing set of courses that has been taught and been going through over at Sunbreak Missionary Church out off of Yelm Highway in Lacey, Washington. If you haven't been a part of the church group, we invite you to be out there as soon as all this coronavirus craziness is over. This is a just a cute little church, great family feel, wonderful folks, led by Pastor Bobby Ball. Um, Again, if you don't have a home church, consider giving us a try. Um, what I'm going to present today is going to be a little bit of a review. If you're really new to this topic, I'm going to encourage you to try to catch up with me privately. We can go through this a little bit differently. And if this is something that you're an old hat at, well, great. Hopefully, I teach you a little something new, something that maybe you haven't seen before. So, we're going to go through this, and I'm sorry it's not going to be in my usual crazy style that you would experience in my live presentations, but I do hope that it's something that you enjoy. So, with that, going to get things going. So, a little bit of introduction. This is the case for the Old Testament. We account for the scriptures of God to be the most sublime philosophy. I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than any other profound history whatsoever. Now, this coming from one of my heroes, Sir Isaac Newton. So many individuals try to identify that um, our early scientists were actually more in tune with God than some of the later scientists. And as I often tell my class, I am a big fan of Louis Pasteur as well, who identified that if you have a little bit of science, it leads you away from God. But if you have a lot of science, it reveals the miracles of God. Now, for those of you who don't know, I have a bit of a background in virology, microbiology, and a few other ologies. And so this is one of those things where I am pretty familiar with the science aspect of it, and I try to do a whole lot of fun things in this. So, what is apologetics? For those who don't know, or for those of you that are just trying to do a little bit of a review, apologetics is based on the Greek word apologia. Now, it's not meaning that I'm saying I'm sorry. Instead, it's giving a defense of what you believe. Now, this verse is polemics. Apologetics is designed for the unbeliever and for people who are raising issues or attacks from outside of the church. Polemics, on the other hand, is for dealing with attacks from within the church. So individuals who may be they have different ideas than others. And when I say church, I mean the broader Christian faith group, not any specific church. Most people will know that I'm pretty anti-religion per se. I'm more of a person who strongly advocates a deep relationship with God, our creator, and with Jesus Christ as our personal savior. Sorry, coffee is important. Now, what are some of the key tenets of this course? Now, we've talked about them over this time period, and one of those is sola fide, sola scriptura, solus Christus, sola gratia, sole Deo gloria. Means by faith alone, scripture alone, by Christ alone, by grace alone, and to God be the glory alone. We're going to go walk back through what are some of the definitions of proof. Talk a little bit about, we've gone through and discussed evolution as an issue. It was brought about by a guy named Charles Darwin. And as Christians, honestly, we don't have a problem with microevolution. Where we run into problems is where we're dealing with macroevolution. And with macroevolution, we have to deal with whether or not this is a finely tuned universe, finely tuned design. Um, with microevolution, now this is by definition where within the same species, you can have various changes and evolutions where you go from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane and back again. A macroevolution is where you go from a fish to a dog. So we're changing species. Now, when we look at some of the challenges for most atheists and individuals who are looking at what happens within evolution, I identify honestly that as a scientist, I have to tell you, It takes more faith to believe in a step-by-step phyletic evolution model, the one that's advocated by Darwin. It takes quite a lot of faith to even believe in the ideas of punctuated equilibrium, which is a evolution in chunks kind of model. And again, I take a look at what is out there. You look at all of the laws of physics, you look at the science and the way that so many things seem to be so finely tuned that they follow rules, up to and including the second law of thermodynamics, which identifies that, everything breaks down. Now, this runs counter to an evolutionary model that identifies that everything should be advancing. A couple of guys abused Fisher's theorem that was put out in mathematical biology back in 2017, and they identified that Fisher, who was trying to make a link between evolution and genetics through mathematical possibilities, actually identified that his assumption was that there should be 1,000 positive mutations for every one negative mutation. What we actually observe instead is that we see 1,000 negative mutations for every one positive mutation. And then in addition to that, what we also identify is that we see that those mutations are often deletions from the original DNA. They are not additions to that DNA. So that changes things as well. Now, the Big Bang, we can measure it, we can see it. We can absolutely point back to the fact that science is in total agreement that there was at some point a Big Bang. And that, there are some issues with what's called MEST. Now, I borrow this term from a group of Scientologists, but I like the acronym, so you'll have to forgive me on that. MEST, again, is matter, energy, space, and time. And what we pointed out was that if someone was going to truly create these things, they would have to be in a position where they couldn't be a victim of these things. So therefore, a God who is omnipotent, omnipresent, he can't be a victim of matter, energy, space, or time. And in fact, one of the things that is shown in the New Testament is that very first miracle that Jesus does, where he's converting a water into wine. It shows that he has control over matter and energy and space and time, all in that moment. Now, in one of our previous lectures, we talked about some of the challenges with time and how really it is a timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly thing. It's not as straightforward as most people think. And in fact, it's one of those situations where what we perceive as time is totally relational to Einstein's theory, where it's based on where we are in relation to gravity. Excuse me. Now, multiverse problems. Some people have proposed that, mathematically it's possible to have multiverses. It still doesn't explain one key little thing. How is it that we ended up in this one finely tuned, amazing universe that seems so unique just to us? That just doesn't, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't explain anything. So a few challenges there. We talked about some of the issues with coexist versus contradict, those crazy bumper stickers that we see all over the place. And really what this amounts to is pluralism. And asking the question, can they all be right? And what we discussed was that no, really they can't. Now, apologetics links directly to what we consider as the four crucial questions. Man's ultimate search here. Man wants to know where he came from. Why is he here? How should we live? And where are we headed? Well, certainly not to the store to get toilet paper today in light of the recent coronavirus things. And I'm still trying to figure out how people equated the idea of needing all that toilet paper as it relates to an upper respiratory virus. Yeah, I don't get it. Different types of proof. We talked about this. Differences between axiomatic, logical, mathematical, empirical, historical, legal, model-based, and relational. Axiomatic, absolutely no doubt about it, very straightforward. You jump up, you fall down, proof of gravity. Logical proof. Well, if I weigh so much and I jump so high, I'm only going to fall at this rate. Think that links back into the mathematical proof. Empirical proof, you can repeat this experiment, quantify it, measure it, no problem. Historical legal proof, we talked about how this relates to when we are looking at different cases reproving different ideas over and over again. So we can look at the way that a plant grows and see that it grows based in a particular manner using specific structures, that kind of thing. Model-based relational proofs. Model-based, think of the weather. If in a closed system, nothing changes, then the temperature will hold at 62 degrees. If, on the other hand, something changes, well, now all of a sudden we're going to be at 64 degrees and cloudy. Relational proof. This is totally based on who's telling you the truth. Now, you don't know me from Adam if you're someone who's not associated with my group. So I totally get that. And what I tell everyone that when they enter my class, challenge absolutely everything I say. You don't believe me? Look it up. Challenge me. Bring it back and let's go through it. One of the things that most relational proofs is based on is like if your mom and dad told you, or someone that you trust, they're in the white lab coat, that sort of thing. So proof doesn't mean the same thing in logic, mathematics, and physical sciences as it does in like historical or legal investigations. What I mean by that is there's a huge difference between empirical science and forensic science. Empirical science creates a pathway in which we can create experiments that can be repeated, experiments that can come up with the same outcomes, whereas forensics is trying to use a level of logic associated with what we can guess happened. Now, proofs aren't arrived at in the same manner and with the same tools in each one of these fields, so that's something you have to be very mindful of as well. And it's not really possible to disprove many kinds of assertions. So there's a lot of things that people come up with that unless you can go back and repeat the experiment, you're just not going to know. One of which is how we got here. Well, we can't go back then. We can't review that. So that's kind of a challenge. Now, a lot of people ask, well, on what authority do you base your opinion? What makes your morality better than mine? And for those individuals who are currently struggling with um, modern hedonism and things of that nature, where they're trying to figure out, uh, what makes this right or that wrong? What makes you right or you wrong? How can what I believe be wrong compared to what you believe? Well, a lot of that we look at as Christians based on the Bible. And we'll talk a little bit about why we can do that in just a moment. Now, did talk about how ethics are a little bit different than morals. And one of the examples here is this is, again, this was from my master's thesis where it talks about all the different ways that you make a decision on a daily basis and what you may be basing that decision on, whether it's your personal ethics or your professional ethics. Your personal ethics might be that committing murder is wrong, but as a professional, as a soldier, as a sniper, you feel that pulling that trigger is absolutely the right decision. You go from a Kantian to a utilitarian mindset. I'm going to give out this new medication, chloroquine, in order to try to solve the coronavirus. And yeah, I might lose 100 people, but I might save 100,000. Does that make that the right choice? From a utilitarian perspective, yes. From a Kantian perspective, no, because all loss of life is dreadful. Now, irony of ironies, one can look at the fact that because of the number of elective procedures that are currently canceled in most states, technically this virus is going to save more lives than it hurts because of the number of abortions that aren't going to be committed. Oops, did I say something controversial? Yeah, sorry, deal with it. I'm not politically correct. What about all these other books that are out there? Are they right? Are they wrong? What makes them different? Well, we talked about how the Book of Mormon is basically written by one individual who when he looked at it, was supposedly transcribing all this information from these golden tablets that no one else has seen based on archaeology that no one else has been able to prove. Buddhism, written about a single prince and his ideas and his influences and what he experienced as a poor rich kid who just stepped outside of the castle. Islam, again, written about a single individual who sits and basically says, look, I want to take a monotheistic faith out to all of these individuals who believe in all these other faiths. But it's been so many different challenges that associated with that you have only the writings of Muhammad. And so it's only the writings of one person. The Book of Mormon is one person. Buddhism, the books are written by one person. Now, Hinduism is a collection of wisdoms and things like our modern proverbs that we would find in the Bible that are about 3,000 years old. And so they were universal truths that were captured by various different writers. But even still, it's not really pointing in any single faith. In fact, Hinduism has the largest number of gods out there than any other faith. Now, what's so unique about the Bible? Well, it's kind of more than just one book. If you look at the Catholic version, there's 73 books. If you look at the Protestant version, there's 66 books. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on the Protestant version because I'm not a Catholic. I'm not going to talk about what I don't know about. Now, it was written over a period of over 1,500 years by 40 different authors on 3 different continents in 3 different languages. That's pretty amazing. I don't know about you, but if you've ever played the Whisper game, it's one of those that I can't even get 10 students to come up with the same statement from beginning to end if I play that with one. The really weird part about all of this is that it's one unifying message. That's the thing that gets most people, that really just, you don't see that anywhere else. Now, how do you define the character and function of Christian apologetics as it relates to Scripture? Now, Dr. Phillips explained it is that we live in the flesh, but the muscles that we fight with are not flesh. Our wars not fight with weapons of flesh, yet are strong enough in God's cause to demolish sophistries. And the arrogance that tries to resist the knowledge of God is just insane. Every thought is our prisoner, captured to be about in the obedience of Christ. Sorry for the typos. I did this kind of quick this morning, sorry. The book of Job, it defends God's dealings with man and even talks about why it's different than what the pagans believe. Psalms 14, 19, Romans 120 all seem to confirm the marvels of nature and point to an intelligent and all-powerful God. Acts 17 preaches, Paul is there. He's giving a very apologetic sermon to very skeptical unbelievers. And you talk about what does God do throughout the Bible? I mean, even just with Moses in the Old Testament, he sends Moses to go do 2 proofs to the Pharaoh. Even then, he's defending, who am I and what is it that I'm doing? So what is this Bible? What is it really? The way I define it is a collection of canonized texts that are the basis for our belief in a single, unifying, omnipresent, omnipotent, monotheistic faith. Now, where this confuses some of my friends that are Muslims is they seem to think that when we talk about God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, we as Christians know them to be one. However, they do not understand the Trinity and see it as polytheism, worshiping 3 different separate entities. Explaining the Trinity is definitely a topic for a whole nother class because it is challenging, but it's still one of those that the Bible for us is a monotheistic faith and a monotheistic ethical approach to life. Now, the texts include history, poetry, prophecy, philosophy. It's written by over 40 authors. It's written over 1,500 years. It's written to reach all generations, not just the ancient ones. Just look at the language. Sorry, coffee, very important. Now, what do I mean by that? So when we're looking at the Old Testament, and let's just take a look at the book of Genesis, one area where people get really critical is in the whole idea of a 6-day creation. Now, when we talk about that, we're actually thinking about and talking about the idea that here we have individuals that are in the late Bronze Age. They are just starting to work with metals. Is it really possible to have that general audience understand quantum physics, astrophysics, what a quark is, a Boson-Higgs particle? No, of course not. However, is it written so that all generations could understand the lessons that are laid out there? Yes. Now, why do we have so many different translations? Well, every generation tries to pull through into the language of that time the same message, the same information, but in a way that makes sense to that common person. So as an example, I don't know anyone that still uses Shakespearean language. They don't speak in these and thous and those. So using the old King James Version, while I like that version, isn't really going to reach the modern person who is currently an expert in text speech. So that's why when we look at the different translations, it's meant to reach a different audience, usually for that time period. Now, as a book, even the last book of the New Testament is older than 2,000 years old. The earliest book of the Old Testament is over 3,500 years old. It has served as the basis for modern science starting in the 17th century, based on an unchanging God of order, purpose, and consistency. Now, when we talk about all these different writers, we look at all these different folks who, again, 40 different authors. When we look at who all these authors are, we have wise men, we have kings, we have princes, we have prophets, we have tax collectors, we have physicians, we have missionaries, we have fishermen. How could all of them, including shepherds, Levites, priests, musicians, how could they come together and write such a succinct, single, unifying document? I struggle. Now, apologetics in the Old Testament. Attacks started early in the Old Testament. And in fact, one of the earliest complaints was that there was no way Moses could have written the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, archaeology has now actually found out that some of the languages that were written at that time were actually older than Moses. And since Moses was technically raised as an Egyptian prince, he would have been very well educated. He would have been well versed in science, writing, math, etc. So it's very possible that he would have had a written document that could have been handed down, in addition to what the Jews continue to do even to this day. It's also practiced on in the Samoans, the Maoris, some of the older Pacific Islander tribes, where you have very long oral histories. I have one friend of mine who, she is Maori. She can tell me her entire family lineage going back 30 generations. Now, that takes a lot of memorization, but it's done as a song. And so when you look at a lot of the Old Testament, it is written in Hebrew and in a way that is actually quite poetic and would have been easy to memorize. Most young Jewish boys, in order to try to become students of the greatest rabbis, have memorized most of the first 5 books of the Bible well before they even start being taught by rabbis. In fact, it's kind of a test about how they are doing as students of God. Now, the pagans attacked it simply because they worship creations. They worship creation itself, the seasons. Oh, it's fall, we must worship this god. Oh, it's spring, we must worship Asheroth. Oh, it's this time period, we must worship Baal. Polytheism. I mean, for them, they struggled with how could one god do all of this? When we look at the Norse, when we look at all of the ancient mythologies, so many people struggled with trying to identify any kind of a monotheistic faith. That's what makes Christianity and Judaism so incredibly unique, because they do walk and dance and treat every aspect of their life linked directly to one creator. And it's, if you look at the Old Testament, a lot of what is layered in there that you may not understand from the early context is Moses, as he tells the tale of even Genesis, even the story in the garden, is slapping around some of the pagans by saying that the woman would crush the heel of the snake and things of that nature, because for them there were quite a number of people who worship snakes. So saying that this human or this child eventually would crush the snake is an idea that the faith in God, in Yahweh, Elohim, would eventually crush a faith in these snakes. Now, polemics. Now, there are some people who, somewhere along the way, and one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of religion over relationship is simply because every time man inserts himself into a really simple faith, he just screws it up. He adds rules, he adds traditions, he adds his own interpretations. And so with that, you can get some really perverted doctrine, people taking things totally out of context and really messing with people. So these are the Pebonites, the Pelagians, the Radicals, the Montanists, the Moonies, the JWs, the Seventh-day Adventists, etc. anytime you get erroneous teaching and claiming that they only are the only ones that have the right interpretation, this is something that really creates problems. So, what are the books of the Bible? Well, we got 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. And it's broken out by law, poetry, major, minor prophets, history, the Gospels, the epistles, sometimes known as Paul's letters, a little bit of history, and some of the general letters that were written to help edify, encourage, and clarify even certain ideas within the faith. Now, what about the Old Testament? What makes up, this crazy book? Well, it's actually 39 books, 17 books of which are history. The first 5 are called the Law or Torah or Pentateuch if you use the Greek: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The 12 books of Old Testament history include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Esther, that sort of thing. The books of wisdom, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, some even include Lamentations in there. You also have the 5 books of major prophets, and then you have the 12 books of minor prophets. Now, a point of clarification is the only way something can be considered someone can be considered a prophet is if what they said aligns with things that are already in the Bible, and it actually happens. It actually comes true. So, as an example, when you look at Ezekiel and chapters 34 through 38, it talks of a time period where Israel will come back into being as a country in less than a day. Now, here's a weird thing. It happened in the sense that you had the League of Nations come together, basically identify that, here in a post-World War II scenario, we're going to give the Jews their own country. The Brits volunteered it up, and they said, here you go, you can have Israel, and this is going to be for you, even though it's mostly desert at this time. We're sure you can do something wonderful with it. And then a president in the United States, Eisenhower, is the first one to actually recognize Israel, and all of this took less than 16 hours. So technically, that's less than 24 hours, which means that since 24 hours is the number that we use to annotate what a day is, that would mean God recreated Israel in less than a day in accordance with Ezekiel. Now, there's over 200 prophecies that talk about Jesus coming forward as a Messiah, and he fulfilled over 100 of those while he was on earth. There are another multitude of prophecies that talk about his second return, and that's a whole nother course, but we'll get into that later. Right now, we're going to try to focus primarily on the Old Testament. Now, just as kind of a side note, one of the things that comes up in like the book of Revelations is talking about the number 666, the number of the beast. Well, I hate to break it to kind of everyone. Carbon, which you are 18% carbon, the electrical structure of that is 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. 666. So 18% of every single person is the same number as the number of the beast. So there is a verse in Romans that talks about, no, there are none that are righteous, no, not one. If we use just a scientific method to approach this, I would say it's true, because 18% of us are not pure. One could argue that is what makes up, some of the impurities that are in us. That is a sinful nature of us, and none of us want to be sinful, but we all seem to make the same mistakes. Now, this is where I think from the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments are one of the greatest gifts that God could ever provide us in order to give us kind of a moral foundation on which to base everything else that we do. Now, I've yet to meet anyone who couldn't. I've yet to meet anyone who, through the existence of their life, didn't in somehow, some way, some form, some fashion break at least most of the 10 Commandments, proving yet again why we were going to need a savior. As someone who was a former Buddhist, the 10 Commandments is one of the things that helped me make my decision to become a follower of Christ, because I knew that there were many philosophies within Buddhism that aligned very directly with what the 10 Commandments say, as well as the teachings of Christ. What I also knew was that the whole idea of dharma and karma were going to violate what you could do, because there's no way to escape that circular level of hell, basically. You can never really escape dharma or karma. And even if you are a specific type of Buddhist, if there's not a priest that's there at the time when you died, you may end up in one of the 30 different versions of hell that exist. So that creates a bit of a problem. Identifying that there's just no way I was ever going to be good enough. There was no way I could ever save myself. It was very humbling. And it was humbling to the point that I knew that I was going to need someone to help save me in order to get into a right relationship with God. Now, some interesting facts. Number of books, 66, chapters, 1,189. Longest word, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Good luck, you try. Longest verse, Esther 8:9. Shortest verse, John 11:35. We're all familiar with this. Jesus wept. Middle books, usually considered Micah and Nahum. Now, the one that I like is the middle chapter and the middle verse of the middle chapter, Psalms 118, verse 8. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. Now, the number of languages that the Bible has been translated to, this is kind of interesting as well, is that it's greater than 1,200. Josh McDowell recently published that it was actually now greater than 1,400. Now, one of the key points to this is that in the epistle to Timothy, Paul points out that all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished to do all good works, or to all good works. We never say that, unless it's explicitly put forward by the author in a particular book, that God is asking that author to transcribe his direct words. What we do say is that everything that is in the Bible is inspired by God. And so that's a bit of a difference. One of the things that Muhammad pointed out was that everything he put forward was a direct transcription of what Gabriel told him. The problem is that Muhammad couldn't write. So he actually had to then tell someone else who had to then write it down. So a bit of a challenge. Now, why does the Bible stand alone? Well, it's unique in its continuity. It's unique in its circulation. It's unique in its translation. It's unique in its survival. It's unique in withstanding attack. And one of the things is Diocletian in 8300, he attempted to burn every single Bible. He had them all gathered up throughout the Roman Empire in order to destroy every single one of them. And it just didn't work out. Because then Constantine would come along a little bit later on and take the 25 best and most perfect condition Bibles that they could find and actually republish yet again and spread throughout the Roman Empire this thing that we call the Bible. Now, a little bit later on, one of the philosophers, Voltaire, who would just absolutely rip on pretty much anyone that believed in the Bible, he prophesied that he felt that the entire Bible and Christianity would disappear within 100 years. Really funny thing is that his house would later become a home of a Bible printing press. Who says God doesn't have a sense of humor? Now, big picture. This was written over 1,500 years across 60 generations, 40 plus authors, different walks of life, different places, different times, different moods, different continents, 3 different languages, written on hundreds of controversial subjects, brought together in an absolute harmony from beginning to end. There is no other book in existence that is quite like the Bible. Now, textual criticism. Textual criticism is how we actually determine, is what we have accurate? Does it look the same as what we believe early copies look like? Is it an original autograph or manuscript? How do we determine, is this accurate? Now we look at the differences in the spelling, the punctuation, the grammar, the insertions, deletions, etc. And what we find is that right now, with 100% certainty, over 98% of the Old Testament and 99.5% of the New Testament is absolutely accurate compared to pieces that we had before. Now, what do we base that on? Discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Codex Vaticanus, early codices from different generations. What we also base it on is some interesting things like most of the Old Testament, there's no punctuation. And so someone would be handwriting and copying the entire section. And the process that the Old Testament scholars used was so devout that they would cleanse themselves before they would start to make a copy. If they made a mistake, they would burn that whole page, start over from the beginning, go purify themselves again, come back and restart. And then they would restart. And if any little bit was off, they'd have to start the whole process again. So when we say that we have absolute 100% certainty in that the version we have today is accurate in how it is um, in content, linked and perfect, and that there's like no deviation, not even one little tittle. A tittle is the smallest punctuation mark that you can use in Hebrew. Basically, it's a period. Now, hate to get into the weeds, but got to help you try to understand some of the depth of this. When we're talking about different literary terminology, and so I want to make sure you understand we're all on the same page. An autograph is an original physical writing by the author. A manuscript is a copy of that autograph. A primary source written by the person who were the eyewitnesses. Secondary sources are individuals who heard it from that first witness. Now, one of the things that kind of goes along with that is that they come secondhand information, and it can no longer be disputed by those who were present or alive at the time. Now, literary works are usually considered primary sources if written within a generation or a century of the event. The closer the writing is to the event, the more reliable the writing becomes. The more manuscripts you have, even those with errors, the better chance you have of reconstructing the original autograph. Now, how does this compare with other works? We have a lot of other books that we believe are accurate. We find faith in. We, absolutely say, hey, this is accurate. This is great. So we'll pull from the world of philosophy. Aristotle's work, we had 5 manuscripts, but they were 1,400 years from the time that the events actually happened. Now, 1,000 manuscripts were dated 1,200 years after the events that occurred in 384 to 322 BC, and the earliest dated copy is AD 850. That's a huge span of time. Plato, many of us had to read most of Plato's works. Now, we have found 210. Previously, we thought we could only find 7 manuscripts, but all of them still date from 1,200 years after the events. They were written between 427 and 347 BC, with the earliest copy being AD 900. How about some histories? Now, forgive me, I'm not a Roman. So some of my pronunciations of some of these is going to be just a little off, but we treat these as if they are incredibly accurate. There's individuals who have absolutely no doubts about their authenticity and believe in them firmly. Pliny the Younger's work, now these are letters that are manuscripts dated from 750 years after the events. Earliest copy, AD 850. Pliny the Elder, these are on topics of natural history, has 200 manuscripts dated 900 years from the events actually occurring, written in AD 23 to 79. Earliest copy is dated AD 1000. Herodotus wrote 8 manuscripts dated 1,300 years after the events occurred. Now, we have since found additional manuscripts, but still we're looking at 1,350 years after they occurred. The earliest copy is from AD 800 or AD 900. Caesar, we all believe Caesar existed, but his histories of the Gallic Wars, we find out that, we have been able to find 251 manuscripts dated 900 years after the events, written in 10 to 44 BC, and the earliest copy is AD 1000. Tacitus, Greek history, again, his earliest copy dated 850, and it was written 750 years after the events. Sophocles, the tragedies. How many of you had to read these in English literature? In this, we had 193 manuscripts dated 1,200 years after the events, written back in 496 BC, and the earliest copy is from AD 900. Now, how does the Bible compare to these? Now, the total count for the early New Testament manuscript available today is over 25,000. Now, Josh McDowell recently claimed that we have closer to 66,000 with the advent of many discoveries and artifacts like mummy wrappings that contain biblical manuscript fragments. Now, we have 5,795 Greek manuscripts that are dated within 30 to 150 years of the events occurring, and the earliest copy dated 100 AD 117. We have over 7,974 manuscripts in other languages, all dated earlier second century and on within 100 to 150 years of the events actually happening. We have the Latin Vulgate, which was the considered primary source for an extensive amount of time with over 10,000 manuscripts from the 3rd century, and it was, again, 300 to 350 years after the events occurred. The Bible and the New Testament in particular has only primary source authors who were witnesses or who were alive at the time of the events. The New Testament autographs were complete and in use by the end of the 1st century AD, and surviving manuscripts and fragments dated within 25 to 150 years of the events. So there were plenty of people that could have been around who could have easily contested anything that was put forward in these manuscripts. They could have said, yeah, this happened. No, this didn't happen. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus didn't do that. But instead, all of these are written within a time period where it's all within 1 to 2 generations of the events happening. Now, here's how you compare this. How many of you have family members that served in World War II? The stories of the experiences of those World War II soldiers and individuals who survived during that era are being told to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. Now, the story may have a little bit of a change to it, but there are probably still a few witnesses who could say, you were never in Paris, or this, that, or the other. Someone who could contest it. But we have the exact span of time in terms of 2 to 3 generational differences between the time that the events occurred, when they're being written or told or shared. Now, some examples of manuscripts that we have on fragments that are actually on display today. We have the John Ryland fragments. They're in Manchester, and they contain segments of the book of John, and they are the earliest New Testament manuscript dated 117 to 138 AD. Now we have the Bodmer papyri. These are dated at AD 200. They're housed in Geneva. They contain the books of Luke, John, Peter, and Jude. We have the Chester Beatty papyri, and they're dated at AD 250. They are housed in Dublin, Ireland, and they actually have most of the New Testament. The Codex Vaticanus, this is written in AD 325 to AD 350. This is housed in Rome. This has most of the Old and most of the New Testament. We have the Codex Sinus, I can't even begin to pronounce it. Tacitus. This is written in AD 340. It's in Leipzig, Germany. It has half of the Old Testament and almost all of the New Testament. We have the Codex Ephremi Rescriptus. This was written in AD 345. It's housed in Paris, France. We have the Codex Alexandrinus. This was written in AD 450. It's housed in the British Museum. I mean, these are all amazing proofs on the history and how close that these things were written at the time when the events occurred. Now, I'm going to close out today. I hope that you enjoyed this. We've got so much more to dig into, but this concludes this part of the Old Testament and the Old Testament history and why you can rely on the Bible. This segment of Apologetics, we've got so much more to get through. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of the day. Keep yourself safe, and remember, wash your hands.